With all of the faith evolutionists place in Darwin's theory, they seem to forget that in his final days, when faced with the reality of his impending death, he renounced evolution and became a Christian once again. According to some accounts, his actual last words were to the effect that evolution was false. If the founder of the theory rejected it, why shouldn't the rest of us? I decided to investigate. In 1831, just before his fateful voyage aboard the HMS Beagle, Darwin received his bachelor's degree in theology from Christ College at Cambridge. His goal up to that point was to become part of the clergy as a parson. Whether due to the influence of Charles Lyell's Principles of Geology, to the untimely deaths and illnesses suffered by his family, or to some other factors, he was no longer a believer in God by the time he published On the Origin of Species in 1859. He was never openly atheist, and even seemed to appeal to theists by changing subsequent editions of Origin to contain words such as creator. He died at his home called Down House with his family by his side on April 19th, 1882. He was buried in Westminster Abbey close to John Herschel and Isaac Newton. 33 years later, in August 1915, a well-respected Lady Hope published her account of a conversation she had with Darwin in his final days. This account appeared first in the American Baptist magazine The Watchman Examiner, and then a few days later in the religious section of the Boston Evening Transcript. Her story, as she published it in 1915, simply recalls a visit she had made to the Down House in autumn of 1881 by Darwin's request. Chroniclers differ on the precise date, but it supposedly happened sometime between September 28th and November 8th of 1881. According to her account, she found Darwin reading from the Book of Hebrews, which he referred to as the Royal Book. By her account, Lady Hope made some allusion to the strong opinions expressed by persons on the history of the creation, its grandeur, and then their treatment of its earlier chapters in the Book of Genesis. He seemed greatly distressed. His fingers twitched nervously, and a look of agony came over his face as he said, "I was a young man with unformed ideas. I threw out queries, suggestions, wondering all the time over everything, and to my astonishment, the ideas took like wildfire. People made a religion of them." He then emphatically invited her to return the following afternoon to gather his servants and tenants in front of his summer house and preach to them. After a particularly flattering description of the man, her account ends there. It is important to note that in her story, no evangelism ever took place. She never did openly state that Darwin had converted, nor did she ever say he had rejected evolution. If he had converted, he must have converted prior to the meeting. In her account, she accurately described his trembling fingers and vivid details of the interior and exterior of the Down House. Darwin's family were Christians and would have preferred a conversion, but when the story finally reached England, they were quite shocked. His son Francis publicly remarked, "Neither I nor other members of my family have any knowledge of Lady Hope, and there are almost ludicrous points in her statement that make it impossible to believe that she ever visited my father at Down. Lady Hope's account of her interview with my father is a fabrication, as I've already publicly pointed out. I have no reason whatever to believe that he ever altered his agnostic point of view." His daughter, Henrietta, also remarked, "Lady Hope was not present during his last illness, or any illness. I believe he never even saw her. He never recanted any of his scientific views, either then or earlier. We think the story of his conversion was fabricated in the USA." His granddaughter Nora also publicly referred to the testimony of Lady Hope as an evangelical slur. On September 28th of 1881, Darwin invited atheists Edward B. Aveling and Ludwig Buchner to lunch at the Down House. This lunch was joined by his son Francis. According to Aveling, during the lunch the conversation turned to their atheism, to which Darwin quipped, "I am with you in thought, but I should prefer the word agnostic to the word atheist." When asked why he abandoned Christianity, he responded rather succinctly, "It is not supported by evidence." If Darwin had rejected evolution in the fall of 1881, he must have changed his mind again by the week before his death the following April, when he wrote a preliminary notice to an article by W. van Dyck on sexual selection in Syrian street dogs. In this preliminary notice, Darwin referred his readers to two of his books. One was his Variation Under Domestication, in which he promotes his theory of evolution by natural selection, introduces pangenesis, and opposes any any divine intervention or guidance in nature. The other was the descent of man, of which the first chapter is entitled The Evidence of the Descent of Man from Some Lower Form. So it seems very unlikely that Darwin recanted nor converted, but it also seems unlikely that such an upstanding woman would have made up such a story. Lady Hope was held in high regard among those who knew her, seen as a very trusting soul who was even naive enough to have been forced into bankruptcy when she was defrauded by an ex-convict in 1911. It would seem that the best explanation can be found in the fact that more than 3 full decades had passed from the time of the supposed meeting and the time in which she published her story. In August of 2012, Donna J. Bridge published a paper in the Journal of Neuroscience detailing a study she performed to test the nuances of memory. Her subjects were shown various objects in various locations. Later, the subjects were asked to view these objects again, but in different locations. The subjects were then asked to recall the original locations of the objects. The subjects all had a tendency to recall the original locations of the objects in significantly closer proximity to the new locations. When asked to view the objects a third time in new locations and then recall the previous locations, the same memory distortion occurred. Bridge concluded that memories are updated by new information produced when retrieving them. Bridge followed this up in a February 2014 article in the same Journal of Neuroscience, furthering the study. So the human brain modifies a memory slightly each time it's recalled. For example, when former athletes recall their glory days, the stories become more and more outrageous. Or when a fisherman tells you about the one that got away. Think of it as a game of telephone, or the passing of a story from person to person. Each time the phrase or story is repeated, it is slightly embellished. After several iterations, there is a significant change. Apparently, our minds do this to themselves. Building from this, Julia Shaw of the University of Bedfordshire and Stephen Porter of the University of British Columbia had been examining details of police interrogations in cases where suspects were falsely convicted. On January 14, 2015, they published a paper in the journal Psychological Science detailing an experiment wherein they interrogated 60 students on events they had previously related to their primary caregivers. Over the course of 3 interviews, Shaw and Porter made suggestions to the students that they had avoided details of criminal activity or traumatic events in their stories. By the final interview, of the 30 students that had been told they had committed a crime that never occurred, 21 of them vividly remembered it having happened. Of the 30 told that they had experienced a traumatic event that never occurred, 23 vividly remembered it having happened. So not only does a memory change each time we recall it, they can also be implanted by others. The results of these sorts of anomalies can be observed in a letter by Lady Hope to a Professor James Bowl in the early 1920s, wherein she recounted her visit to Darwin with some new additions. In this last letter, Lady Hope had Darwin calling the book of Hebrews the royal epistle, and saying, "This book, I never tire of it." She also wrote, "And he began to comment on some of the great gospel truths, which I only regret extremely I cannot give verbatim. And then, he spoke of Christ in this way: he is the King, the Savior, the Intercessor, dying, living, and discoursed rather freely and with great animation on different parts of the subject." After 3 decades, there is no telling what the real story of Lady Hope must have been. While it may or may not have been a complete fabrication, it is unlikely that her story occurred exactly as she told it. What really exemplifies memory distortion, however, are the embellishments made by creationists when they retell the story to include a bedside conversion and Darwin's recanting of his theory. The brain works in fascinating ways. The more we learn about it, the more fascinating and mysterious it becomes. The implications of continuously updated and distorted memories are enough to make one understand the importance of the saying, "If you can't show it, you don't know it." The testimony of Lady Hope is just another example of how creationism taught me real science.
Learn more about the real science behind other creationist claims by watching other episodes. If you think there is a creationist claim I should investigate, please comment below. It may become the subject of a later video. In the meantime, subscribe to my channel to make sure you don't miss it.